Today I'm going to talk about Apollo and Urql. This talk is going to be giving you an overview. I'm going to show a couple of demos. These are clients to run GraphQL in your app. So I'm going to just give few cues so you can make a decision of which of them you want to use. One of them is pretty new. It was created earlier this year, which is Urql. The other one has been around for a couple of years, so it's pretty mature, and it's probably the leader in a GraphQL market. So let's start with a small intro. So I'm Gerard Sanz, Google developer expert. My focus is usually Angular, but I've been doing React for the last 4 years. And I mainly started doing React because of GraphQL. I really like the technology, and I was really excited when I built my first proof of concept. And since then, I've been writing blog posts and also going to conferences talking about it. Here you can see, so I'm doing events for the last 2 years full time. So I'm pretty much traveling all the time. Here I changed the color for Toronto. So this is the first time I'm giving a talk in Toronto. That's going to be my 90 talk. So I'm pretty excited. I'm close to 100. Probably it's going to be soon. And I'm also happy that I can travel, to different countries. Probably the most interesting is this trip to Japan. That was last year. This year I'm already booked for a conference in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And obviously when you go into this kind of lifestyle, you just look for cool events in strange, exotic locations. And I think Toronto would classify, so I'm pretty happy to be here. Any of the talks that I cover, I usually also write the blog post. Here you will see that most of my blog posts are Angular, but there's also some content in React. How many people is React developer here? What about Angular? Okay, just few people. Well, it doesn't matter, because GraphQL is a technology that can be used in any of the frameworks. So actually, it's okay. Here, I want to also share with you that I run a couple of events in London. So in London, I run Angular Zone. This is a group that I started 3 years ago now. And GraphQL London is another group that I started 2 years ago. And you can see that sadly, there's more people in GraphQL London than my original group, which is a little bit sad because they are all React developers. So somehow Angular is behind in these communities. And here you can see that it's almost now catching, like doubling the number. And it's almost half of the time since it was created. So GraphQL is really popular. All of the meetups are recorded. So for example, the last meetup of GraphQL London, we were at Twitter offices. We have got like Liv Iron, the creator of GraphQL. We got the full team of Apollo there. That's where I got my t-shirt. I'm not working for Apollo, I'm just a fan. So here you can see why. I'm also a GraphQL trainer. So last week I was in New York giving a full stack GraphQL training for a conference called Buzz.js that happened last week. Maybe you have seen some announcements. Because I do this full time, I also have time to do some silly things, like for example, being the host at conferences. And here you can see me at DroidCon London, and also I was this year at React Europe in Paris as the host. So you probably will see me here and there for these events. This year was also pretty fun. I did this road trip with a conference called ReactiveConf, and they are moving from Bratislava. They are originally from Bratislava, but are moving to Prague. So I went into a road trip where every day I was giving a talk on GraphQL. So I started in Bratislava and we went up to Prague. This is going to, I mean, probably it's not so close to you that you can plan to go to this conference. I mean, it's pretty far from here, but that was fun. So before I go into the comparison, I think it's a good moment to give you an overview, because maybe you are just joining the GraphQL community and you are missing some bits of information. Maybe you think that GraphQL just started this year, or who knows. So I'm going to cover some facts. So actually, GraphQL was created in 2012. So this is a few years back, and they did because they created the technology because they wanted to move from HTML5 to native apps. So they really wanted to create the experience that you had with the web into native apps, and this is how they use it. They use it for Facebook client. And if you have been using Facebook since then, you have been using GraphQL behind the scenes. In history, we have the next year, React is released. So this is very close to the creation of React. The following year, we got React Native. So we can see the timeline of different events. It's not until 2015 that is open source. And the technology is so successful inside Facebook that they want to share it with the community. So they open source it, and they create what is called the reference implementation, which will use JavaScript. At that time, they also decided to open source what will be the Facebook client, and this is now called Relay Classic. And a lot of people started using GraphQL with Relay at that time. 2016, there's a big announcement. Maybe if you have been following GraphQL, you remember. GitHub announced the public API is now going to be accessible through GraphQL. And this is 2016, around September. At that time, they also created the first official website. So this is GraphQL.org. There's also the first time that there's the first conference focused only in this technology. That's GraphQL Summit in San Francisco. 2017, we got the first release of Polo Client. So Polo Client was being developed, but this is the time when they decided to release version 1. And it was a big surprise. These are the people from Meetup group, and they created a really nice client that was in competition with the Relay Classic that Facebook created. There was an answer that didn't take long. Facebook decided to create the first release of Relay, which then they changed the name and they call it Relay Modern. So that replaces what now is called Relay Classic. They got into a small competition, so they released a new version. The guys from Apollo released the second version of the client, and they improved some more things. They introduced a new architecture. We're going to cover some of these details, but they introduced one module for the store that they can implement in different versions, and they also implemented for the network, they implemented link, which will also be extendable and composable, so you can extend your client, adding new features without breaking anything. So that was really nice to see. So this competition got a little bit more spiced earlier this year. So this was early in January, and we got the release of Urql. This is the third client. So we got Relay, then we got Apollo, and now we have Urql. And Urql was kind of answering the feeling from one members of the community that Apollo was getting too complex to set up, because new features were being added. Then the code was just too, there was a lot of boilerplate. So they thought, okay, let's see if we can build a client that will be much easier to set up. And we will see some of the code that resulted from this. We got some exciting news in the community. We got the first release of Prisma. This is a product that comes from the people in Berlin, GraphQL. And they even changed the name of the company to Prisma. So now Prisma is what before was known as GraphQL. They are the ones organizing the conference, GraphQL Europe, that just happened recently. The guys from Apollo also responded with Apollo Engine. So this is kind of in the cloud GraphQL server that you will set up really quick, and that you can use, paying for a subscription. Prisma has also a pay solution, but also you can host it in your infrastructure. So now it's a really good moment to get into GraphQL. The community is pretty mature. There are a lot of libraries, and I would say that today it's a good moment to start looking into this technology. Just after this release of Apollo Engine, we got Apollo Client 2.1. And this introduces some new changes. There's new components that are using render props, which is a new way of implementing high-order components in a little bit nicer interface. And that's more or less the whole timeline. So we got here, and I got into some tweets that people was a little bit like, oh, so now we are going into a fight between another client and Apollo. And I was like, yes, we are into a fight. But this is a friendly fight. I mean, this is just, a healthy competition. And here we can see, besides the joke of a street fight, we can see the two clients that I built. So I built two to-do apps. And you can see they are using material design, so I'm using material UI with the latest bits, so I'm using latest versions for all of the packages, and I'm going to use this as the starting of the conversation. So let's see a little bit of an overview. Maybe I'll show you a live demo. So this is the live demo, and here, I mean, this is just a pretty straightforward to do. It's using a GraphQL server that I created with an online tool, which is called Launchpad. And I'm able to create a GraphQL server on the fly. I can just go change the code, and I use that to build these clients. I also added some emojis. I mean, it's totally compatible with emojis. What can I do? Of course, you love Montreal, so I'm going to put this here, and it's the same. It's the same for Apollo. So we are going to compare these two clients here. Let's just move to the slides again. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to share this so you can also play with the code. So Apollo Client. Apollo Client is probably the most used client in GraphQL. So probably if you are using GraphQL today, you are using Apollo. And I'm going to give you an overview. So this is a client maintained by Meteor. The latest release is 2.3.4, and that's including a lot of different packages. Some of the packages are related to either the cache or the link module. They are doing improvements. There's some work for creating offline experiences, so you can use Apollo also for offline use cases. So it's pretty active, and it's probably the leader on this area. If you are using React, I would say that the implementation of a Polo Client is pretty much up to date. In Angular and Vue, there's some delay. There's always some new features released for React, and then sometime later you can see the same features implemented in the other frameworks. So that will be probably the primer for React, and then Angular and Vue, they get some of these features a little bit later. It's very popular, so you can see that it's kind of winning the popularity contest in GitHub, which is always nice. And what are the main features? So one of the main things that they wanted to fix with Polo Client, compared with Relay, that was the client that existed at the moment, is that it was too complex to use. There were a lot of abstractions that were introduced by Facebook that were not really easy to grasp. So they wanted to create a new client that was really easy to understand and to learn. They also were worried that only React was compatible with Relay. So they introduced also compatibility with Angular and Vue. So that's pretty cool. They also used what is called this catch normalization. When developing an Apollo client, you will deal with the store in the client, and that will be splitting your data from your queries in a normalized way. So there are a few tools that you can use to see how that happens, but that can introduce some complexity. And we will see how Urql is going to do this in a different way. As I was explaining, they introduce a little bit more options. We have the store, we have the link, and then from this tool, there are a few others that are just adding small features. Like, for example, if we want to add more information to the transport layer and get more details on the errors, we can introduce link error, or we can also use, for example, what they are replacing Redux for the store. So they are using a Apollo link state to do that, and then they are growing these different modules just to do introduce different features. One thing that they recently introduced is render props. So now they are advocating render props components over high order components. Who is familiar with the render props, or who is using render props today? So this was introduced a few months ago, and it's now kind of cool to be using. I mean, it's just a different way to implement your components, and probably if you are not using render props, you are going to introduce them pretty soon. Actually, they have the same capabilities of high order components, but maybe you can follow the code a little bit easier. You don't find these calls because they are high order functions. You find functions that return functions, and then you have these chains of calls and parentheses, which can be a little bit mind-blowing. This is another quality of Polo Client, and is the involvement of the community. If we compare, for example, Relay, there's not much going on in Relay development. For the last 8 months, there hasn't been any big announcements. They are missing the conferences. There's no new updates. Of course, it's still working, and is a very valid option, but it's not so. It doesn't get so much love from the community compared to Apollo. So this will be more or less an overview. Let's look into the new option, which is Urql. So Urql, it uses, of course, it uses this image. It's pretty strong client, as you can see, and this is Urql is the acronym for Universal React Query Language, and you can see that the idea behind this library is that you can use it both on the client and also on the server. That's why the universal. From this name, you can also see that it's only targeting React. So they are not targeting Angular or Vue or other frameworks. And it's on top of GraphQL. So as an overview, this is a repository maintained by Formidable Labs, and the creator is Kim Wheeler. If you are in the React community, you probably know him. The latest release is really low, so it's 0.21. So you can see that it's still pretty in early stages. But from the usage that I've done for this talk, I can tell you that it's very promising. So you can start playing with it. The integrations is for now only React. So we are missing some implementations for the other frameworks, and probably if Kim Wheeler is not so excited to build for the other frameworks, probably we are not going to see any others. It's getting quite popular compared to Apollo, and this has been just in few months. So far it's I would say that it's pretty popular, and we can also see that there have been like few talks at GraphQL conferences from Kim Wheeler talking about it. So it's getting there. We also have MIT license, which is just open to use. So let's go into the features. So this one, of course, is also focusing in a nice, easy to use API. And we will see the few examples that basically remove some of the boilerplate that we can see in Polo Client. This will be easier to see on the examples. This is React only, and it uses this, what I call smart caching. So Kim Wheeler came up with a nice idea, which is he keeps a hash of the queries that you send to the GraphQL server and catch the return of that query. If he finds that you run any mutation that can affect these queries that you previously did, it will invalidate those values and try to get the new values from the server. This is a little bit easier implementation than what Apollo is using, but also is really easy to implement in your code. So we will see that in the examples. There's a few things that they implemented in a different way. In Apollo, we have a different component to do every separate operation. So we have one component for queries, one component for mutations, and another component for subscriptions. With Urql, we have a component that will batch all of these in one. So we will have all of the queries, mutations. There's no subscriptions at this point, but all of these queries there will be in a component that is called connect. It's in Urql. They are not advocating for one or the other. You can use any of the two. You can use either render props or high order components. These two approaches are fine. And I'm going to start looking at different areas. So let's start with the setup. And for the setup, I'm going to use this format. I'm going to put both clients side by side, and I'm going to go over different points that I found interesting while I was doing this job. So here, I import Urql in order to do the setup. I pretty much set up the URL for the GraphQL server, setting up the client, and then I used that to set up my provider. So that was pretty easy. On Apollo, I used what is called Apollo Boost that helped me out similarly to what I use in Urql. So that will be pretty much the same, and the rest of the steps are exactly the same as in Urql. So this will be rated exactly the same. I'm going to use a 3 stars system, so they are getting the best 3 stars. And let's see, I think we have time to go and look at the code. So let me just quickly set up this. And here we are looking at the Urql solution. And this is the actual code. I'm using I'm importing the provider and the client, and if I go to this client setup, it's simply importing the client and then setting up that client with the URL for my GraphQL server. So it's pretty straightforward. If I go to the next step, I'm going to use, well, there's other things here. There's some settings for the material UI. I'm going to skip that. And here you can see that I added this provider and passing in the client. So that's going to make the client available to all of these components, and in the center it will be the entry point for my app component. I mean, this setup is pretty standard. It's exactly the same in Apollo. Let's look at that very quickly. So here we have now the Apollo example, and now we are importing the Apollo provider from React Apollo and the client as we did before. So you can see here the differences are minimal. Some of the objects change, so the import here is from Apollo Boost, but the client is also just taking the URL. In this case it's called URL. Okay, so let's go to the index. Most of the code is exactly the same. So you will have maybe some trouble to see differences. Here we are not using provider, but just Apollo provider, and we are using the same technique. We are passing the client as an argument, and that will set up all of the queries running for that provider. Any questions so far? So good. Okay, so that was the setup. Of course, now once I have my application set up connected to the GraphQL server, I can start running my queries. So maybe this is a good time to see how my server looks like. So let's do a little detour, and let me show you this tool. So this is a tool from Apollo, and it's called Launchpad. And this is the actual code that is backing up my server. So you can see I'm showing a couple of to-dos, and then you can see how these to-dos are being laid out. I have an ID, I have a flag, and also the text for the to-dos. Then I created a helper method just to get a nice random ID. I'm using the date. Here you can see the GraphQL schema. So basically I'm defining my to-do type, and then I'm defining the queries that I can run in this schema. I can also define the mutations, and these are basically the CRUD operations. So I can create, update, and delete. Most of the GraphQL schemas are pretty straightforward to read. So you can see there's a type, there are some fields, and probably the only thing that is not so easy to follow is this hash, these exclamation points. Who knows what these do? Who can tell me? Okay, not the, yeah?
Non-nullable.
Non-nullable. So it's a mandatory flag. So that will make all of these three fields mandatory. And we can see that also the arguments when I'm running a mutation. Of course, if I need to remove a to-do, I need the ID of the to-do that I want to remove. So that argument is mandatory. And here is the same for all of the arguments. So every time I'm doing any of the CRUD operations, I will need all of these arguments. Of course, you can change this slightly to create your own to-dos. But I'm going to use this schema. The next thing that we need to define for a GraphQL server is our queries and mutations, and these are going to be backed up by what is called a resolver. And a resolver is just a function. So for example, if we look back at our schema, we see that this type query has one entry, all to-dos, and that gives me a list of to-dos. So how is that is going to be implemented is we're going to add an entry in this query object, and that's going to be a function returning these to-dos. This to-dos is now pointing to this array. So that's, I would say it's pretty straightforward. On the mutations, there are few operations there. We have the delete. The delete is using filter to just discard the to-do with that matching ID. The same with update. We make sure to find the ID, and then we change that with the complete flag, or we return the same object. I mean, I will share this later. You can look into these operations in more detail. But that's pretty much the definition of the GraphQL server. So we have the schema, some resolvers that use pretty much straightforward JavaScript, and then we just make that our endpoint for GraphQL. So let's move on to the next section. So now we are connected to that GraphQL server, and we can start running our queries. So here, maybe I can run a query so you can see how that looks like. On this example, I'm just using one of those entry points. Here I'm showing you GraphQL Playground, and here I can quickly check my GraphQL schema. This is just using introspection, so it's giving me the information just by giving the tool the endpoint. So if you have a GraphQL server, you can also use this tool with that server, and it will give you this information automatically. So I'm going to use the first one, and it will look something like this. So we can see the entry is all to-dos, and from that query I can pick the fields that I want back. One thing that you can see from using this tool is that you will get this nice fields preview. So when I'm typing, I can see the options, and it will just autocomplete them for me. There's also some nice features. I can prettify the query, and then I can also run the query and get, for now it's just the array. Of course, we could connect that to MongoDB or some other data source. For now, it's just in memory on the server. But it's up and running, and I have few examples here that I can share. But let's go back to the comparison. So we just check up the setup. We have the server. Let's go into the queries. So how difficult is to run these queries in these two different clients? Well, this is a diagram that gives you an overview of the architecture, and I'm going to focus on the top part of this, and I'm going to use this query interface. So of course, from a GraphQL server, we can use query or mutations. So now I'm going to look into the queries. So how that works for Urql? For Urql, we use a connect component, and we can just use add all of the queries and mutations as properties. This can be either using render props or high order components, which is pretty convenient, and it gives us caching support out of the box, and it allows multiple queries. So this is more or less the overview for Urql. For Polo Client, we are using a specific component, which is in this case the query component. Apollo is advocating for render props. So in previous versions, they were using high order components, but now in the documentation they are recommending you to migrate to render props. So that's a slightly different approach. It also gives you caching support out of the box. Probably is more sophisticated than Urql. So that's going to be a little bit different as well. There's this different approach. So because we cannot use multiple queries, the way that Apollo is composing the queries is just nesting them. So when you have a query component, you can nest another query component and do separate queries, which can be a little bit, you can end up with different levels of nested components, which is maybe not so easy to follow. With Urql, we have just a connect component, and we can make as many queries in just one level. So that, in my opinion, looks a little bit better. I'm going to rate both with the same 2 stars, because some of the benefits that we get for using, this connect component, sometimes it will get into the way and won't allow us to do the same as we can do with Apollo Client. But with Apollo Client, the complexity, it's getting also into the way. You will see that there's a little bit more code involved, so I couldn't give any of the 2 3 stars. There's few things that can be improved in both options. Let's see how that looks in code. Share some light. So I'm going to look into how I'm showing the list of to-dos. So let's see how that looks. And I'm going to change to Urql. And here, let me quickly go to the application. Over here, I'm going to import all of the different queries. These are queries and also mutations, and I put them all in this GraphQL file. I did the same with Apollo, so I have all of my queries and mutations in one place. Here, Urql uses 2 different functions. One is query, the other one is mutation, but we can see that the queries are pretty much the same, and there's no match. Of course, I don't have time to cover the different queries, but you can come back to this later. Here, I'm going to now show you how the connect component works. And we can find it here. So this is the connect object. As I was explaining, it's taking all of the queries. So it's taking the queries and also the mutations. In case you want to run multiple queries, you could pass all of the different queries like this. Let's imagine we have, instead of to-dos, we have another to-dos. Imagine we have a private section of to-dos. You could also add it. Of course, it's failing because it's not there. But you could also pass multiple queries, and that's really convenient. Within this, we use render props. This is the version using render props. It's the closest to what Apollo uses. So we get all of these, we get an object as a first argument, and this is equivalent to the children property in our component. So from here we can decide what we want to render. We get some helper arguments. In Urql, this is a flag that will tell us when the data has returned from the server. So that will be false by default, and once we get the data from the server, it will become true. The data from the query will be available under this data object, and then some other arguments will be matching. In this case, they are matching the mutations. And then from this moment, I can use this to render some components and remove or add different bits on my layout. So let's see how that looks into Apollo Client. So in Apollo Client, we're going to use a component which is using render props. In this case, is specific for queries, and that will look slightly bit different. My queries now are using GraphQL from Apollo Boost, but they are basically the same. Here we can see that we don't have queries and mutations. We just have this GraphQL helper that will create the queries for us. Okay, Let's see how that changes the code from our to-do list. So let's find the query object. So now, instead of the connect, I have this query object, pretty much the same idea. I have a query property, and I can pass my query into it. And these arguments change slightly, but the same logic applies. So we have an argument that will tell me when the query, while the query is loading, so I can show, for example, a spinner. And then I can also grab errors if there are any errors, and I receive my data from that third argument. And from here there's a lot of material UI, but that would take too much to explain. So we have seen how the query works, and you obviously need some knowledge on React to follow these render props components, but you can look into that later if you are not familiar. For the queries, that's all. So we can look into this new section, and this is when we want to change the data that we host in our GraphQL server. That will change a little bit now. So instead of using the query API, we are using the mutation. And that will give us access to changing our model. So in our case, we can add a new to-do, we can toggle a to-do from not completed to completed, and also, for example, we can remove a to-do when we don't want to use it anymore. So this will be our different APIs. Let's see how these compare. So because we have the same, we can use the same connect component, we can keep it for our logic. As we cover, we can see these two options. In my example, I'm using render props just to make it easier to compare with Apollo. And there's one but, which is we need to return an ID so Urql can match the objects that are already in the cache. Otherwise, it won't be able to match these two objects and update our template. So that's the only thing that it was a little bit kind of magic hidden. Usually you will return this field, but if you miss it, it can fail without you knowing what's going on. So it's a little bit dangerous. There's some nice automatic cache invalidation. When you're using Apollo, you have to introduce a lot of code. And in Urql, that's just working automatically. So it's a little bit nicer. You will see that the code is, I mean, there's no need for any code as long as you introduce that ID. On Apollo, we have a separate component, so they have query and mutations in separate components. They work basically the same, using render props. This is probably the most surprising approach in the design, and Apollo took this decision. They want you to use queries to change the local cache, which is not so easy. You need to use queries, you need to use mutations, and that will change the state of the cache. Of course, if you don't know how to build your own resolvers, that will make it a little bit difficult to set up at the beginning. If you are more familiar with GraphQL, you can implement it, but that's a big change between how Urql works and Apollo works. In the examples that I build, you can see that difference being used. There's few features that we get in Apollo that we don't have in Urql, like optimistic updates. There's nothing in Urql. And in this case, I'm going to rate both with 2. Of course, Urql is still very young, in very young stages, but actually it has some very nice features which you would expect from Apollo. It's really strange that you run a mutation and you don't get your UI updated. You need to do some manual work to change the cache, and that's a little bit an inconvenience. Of course, when you do that manually, you have total control. So you can implement these scenarios like optimistic update, and you can introduce some logic to change the behavior. But then sometimes, or most of the times, you don't want to do that. You just want your application to work and update automatically. So it's it's not easy to make a judgment here. So I'm going to rate. Of course, this is very in early stages, so there are some some holes in the implementation. But I'm hoping that they will fix them, and then this will be fine. Okay, so here. I'm going to cover subscriptions, and before I go into subscriptions, which is a little bit more advanced, let me cover the code. And we can pick for a mutation. We have adding a to-do, toggling a to-do, and removing a to-do. Let's do adding a to-do. So for adding a to-do, I have a separate component that's going to render the input at the top. And here I'm just grabbing my mutation. It's on this GraphQL file. And let's see that mutation. So instead of using the query type, it's using the mutation type and getting an argument, which is the new to-do that I want to create. From that, I can use the create to-do, taking that text, and then it's setting the complete as false. I mean, that will be the initial state for that new to-do. And then I'm returning, I can create a new to-do and also get the new ID that was created and also the fields that were used for it. So in this case, GraphQL is doing two operations. It's doing the put and also the get in one query. So that's that bit there. Okay, let's move into the Urql implementation. Here, there's no query. What we did, because we use the connect component, what I did is I passed the mutation in the connect component, and then I'm using the function and passing the function as a property. So that's a common practice in React. So that's a little bit different. In Polo, we are getting the query in the component, so it's kind of collocated in the component. In Urql, we need to pass it, we need to get it from the connect and pass it down to the component. So I'm getting that as an attribute. In this case, I could also pass it as a prop, but I'm going to pass it as an attribute. And from there, I can use it. I can introduce it into my logic. Here, when I'm hitting the Enter key, I'm going to call that create to do and pass the value of my input field. So that's pretty much the logic behind Urql. On Polo Client is just exactly the same. The only thing that changes here is I'm using a separate component, so I need to import this mutation at the component level, and then I need to add the mutation component in my add to do. So that changes a little bit the implementation of my component. If you are introducing this in an already existing application, you will have to introduce these wrappers all over the place. With Urql, just passing the mutation method, it will just work without changing any code. The same applies. There's also some small differences. I don't really like this how this looks. So look at this create to do. It's setting a variables object, and then I need to define the argument in a second level. I'm not sure why we need these two levels. It's just easier to follow in Urql. So here I'm just passing the argument from my mutation. It's just clearer. So that's a small example. You can also see how we can toggle and remove to-dos with a little bit more time. The last thing that I want to show you, which is a little bit more advanced, is Realtime. And for Realtime, I have a small demo. And here I have a Chrome. This is a different source code. And in this, I implemented subscriptions. Subscriptions is going to be using Apollo. Urql don't have subscriptions. So now in this demo, I'm using Apollo. Let's see how that works. So on the left, Chrome. On the right side, Firefox. And I'm going to, before it was Montreal, Niagara Falls. Everybody has been there. So the idea here is that we can introduce changes in one client, it gets updated in another client. And you can have as many clients as, as your server can support. Here I can also play with different clients that will also work in both sides. So you can see it's pretty cool. How you get this in GraphQL is quite easy. Let me remove that. And that works slightly using a different architecture. So now, instead of using the query or the mutation, we are using the subscription, which is in the middle. What subscriptions will do is will allow the clients to subscribe to changes on the server. So the first thing that you will do when you are using subscriptions is sending to what mutations you want to listen and receive notifications from those mutations. So for example, in this application, I want to know when a client adds a new to-do. And I want to receive a notification with the body of that new to-do, so I can update my UI. That will go into this bit of the diagram. So that will just store that subscription, and then when a mutation matches that subscription, it will send a notification to that client. So for example, if somebody creates a new to-do and we subscribe to that mutation, we will receive an event. And that is going to happen for any number of clients. Of course, if we implement this, we need to take care about, how is that going to scale? Because the server is going to grow on the number of notifications that it's going to be sending. So that's a little bit more complex to architect. Using this same solution, I created Q&A application that was used for GraphQL Europe. And during the panel that was for 1 hour, I counted 3 million messages, but it held up pretty well. So it didn't fail, and I implemented a client maybe in a couple of days. So it's pretty solid technology. For this example, I created a subscription only for Apollo, so there's no support for Urql. So if you want to use subscriptions, there's only Apollo to use that. And this is using Subscribe to More API, and somehow it's still using a reducer. And they move away from Redux, but they are using a reducer for this implementation, which is surprising. There's no rating for Urql, it's behind, and I'm going to show you the code. You will see that there's a lot of work to do on this area to get a nice implementation. So let's see that as the last bit. And here for adding subscriptions, the first thing that I need to do is I had this implementation for regular queries and mutations. If I want to add subscriptions, I need to introduce a different setup. I need to use WebSockets, and you can see the amount of code that I have to use. There's a lot of small magic here going on, but you can see that the scenario moving from here to here is a big change. A lot of this code is boilerplate. You can just copy and paste it. So it's a little bit. I think the Apollo team could do a better job hiding some of these behind some APIs. I guess the best would be just to have this bit here, and maybe something like this. Just, you know, the two URLs and maybe one import. That would be ideal. But we have this like amount of work just to make this setting to work, which I don't understand. Here on this application, I'm going to run a subscription which I define in the same file. So let's see that subscription here. And as you can see, this is a very flexible, because from the client I can tell the server what notifications I want. So here I'm saying, okay, I want from the to-do type in the server, I want to be notified about these operations. So every time I create a to-do, update a to-do, or remove a to-do, I want to get a message. And you can specify exactly what information you want. So I want to know what operation was. So it will tell me if it's which one of these was. It will come into this field. From the node, I will get the information of the to-do. And this last field is to tell me if it's a remove. If I delete the node, these fields will come empty, but the removed to-do will be coming in this last bit. So we can specify everything on this query, which is now a subscription. And on my application, I will set up this on the root component. And the way we do this in, let me find it out. We will execute the subscription by calling this subscribe to new to-dos on the component will mount. And let me see if I can find I need to find the subscription. Okay, here. So for the subscription, I'll be using a high order component setup. You could move this. This is to show how that would look. If you want to use the component for subscriptions, you can also use it, just as we did before. And here I'm using the API that I show you, subscribe to more. This will create a property, which is the one that I called at the top. And this will just run the subscription. And will give us a few callbacks. In this case, I'm using the update query. And from that, from the response of this subscription, I'm going to look into different information. In this line, I'm taking the mutation, so I can discriminate the notification if it's creation, if it's been created, updated, or removed. And on the node, I'm getting the information of the actual to-do. The logic, it's a little bit more complicated, but you can see the different cases here. Let's look into a creation. So the first thing that I'm going to look is if it exists. This is a little bit strange, but you need to imagine that when I create a new to-do, I will receive also the notification from the server. The server doesn't know if I was the client that I created the to-do or it was another client. So that will add some more complexity. I need to discriminate the to-do that I create myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check that it's not already there, because in that case it means that I created that to-do myself. It can also come from another client. So that's a little bit of code that you need to add manually. But then the only thing that you have to do is just return this to-do, and then Polo is going to take it from there. If it doesn't exist, I will just add it to my catch to-dos, and that will also work. And one thing that you can see here is that I'm not dealing with the catch in any sense, because it's using a reducer. So I can just access the list of to-dos directly. So let's see the final the final round. So this will be like overview. So this is, I think, is a nice option only for React. There's less abstractions, there's less code, less magic, there's less things. I mean, of course, it's basic features, but if you want to use queries and mutations, it's enough. On Apollo, this is a more complete solution. You may also use it in other frameworks, not only React. So if you have different stacks at your company, you can use Apollo for all of them. It's a little bit more opinionated. It gives you, more power, but then you need to learn all of these features separate. So it's getting more and more complicated. Of course, this is a more powerful solution than Urql, and of course I'm going to rate both. I mean, this was a fight, but it's not really a fight. You can use any of the two, and you will probably be fine. So if you want to know more, just few facts. The GraphQL community rocks. It's really big. There's almost, this is in Meetup, but you can think about the volume. It's 30,000 people and growing. There's a lot of conferences right now. We have a GraphQL Europe, GraphQL Summit, Reactive Conf as well, covering GraphQL. And if you want to follow some people, influencers in GraphQL, you have Peggy Races and Sasko from Apollo, and there's also Johannes and Nicholas from Prisma. So that's more or less all that I wanted to talk about. Thanks a lot.